Alright, I know it's early in the year, but I'm calling it here. That was the hottest kiss of 2023. Y'all felt it, y'all know it. Hello, interwebs! I hope you're all doing well because I am here to review the second episode of The Last of Us adaptation over on HBO Max. And right up front, I will just let you all know, I will give you my spoiler-free thoughts of the entirety of the episode, sort of my general impressions, and then in just about a minute or two, I'll go full into spoilers for those of you who have seen the episode. But staying spoiler-free up front, this is another fantastic episode of the show. It's carrying on a lot of the things that the pilot did well, and just going further into exploring the world that we are now in post sort of this big apocalypse. This episode was more focused on like just showing the world as it is now, like what the world outside of the quarantine zone is now, and it was just really cool to just delve into all of that and getting to see the TV show's adaptation of the video game world, and it looks freaking gorgeous. You can already see here, this isn't much of a spoiler, it was in trailers and stuff, but the clickers in the show, oh, they look so good, like straight out of the video game, and yet they have this like really unique, like pretty and yet disgusting quality to them. Like they translated that very well. But even beyond that, just the visuals of the destroyed city that we got like images of at night last time, you know, I was kind of surprised how much beauty we saw in the destroyed world and how much they showed of it. And you can really see the money on screen in this adaptation, because in the last episode we ended it with like the night shot of the two skyscrapers falling on top of each other, which is like an iconic image from the early parts of the game. And I thought like, oh, that's what we're gonna get of that. We see it at night, kind of flashes of light. It makes it easy for the visual effects team to do that because it's like shrouded in darkness. But no, here we get like full daylight shots of this city that's been destroyed, and it looks phenomenal. Like, so rarely do I see shows do like landscapes like this, that characters are like existing within. It's not like a green screen that's behind them. Like they feel like they're very present in this world, and I was just shocked by how pretty and gorgeous it looked. It did not look like a green screen CGI set at all, which is something I get in like other shows, like even Star Wars or like Star Trek. You get these sort of like very CGI ethereal worlds. Like, no, this felt grounded and felt very real, which is really important for the tone of The Last of Us. So all of that was great. And like I said, there's a lot more exposition in this episode. We'll get into specifics in a moment, but there's some specific changes from the game. I'm like, oh, those are unique shifts from the game to the show that I thought were interesting changes, and I think work really well for the adaptation and add a lot of tense scenes to this show, and I'm curious to see how it's going to evolve further. We'll talk about more of that in spoilers. But even within that, we get some great moments between Joel, Ellie, and Tess that really kind of build out and flesh out each of the characters and where they are at right now within the story. And I think that's really necessary to sort of set where we're going to see our characters go further on into the rest of the season. So some good like ground laying for who these characters are now. The only knock I can really say about this episode in terms of, you know, like dinging it a little bit is there is a sequence in this that I'll talk more about in spoilers that I feel is a tad repetitious of the pilot episode, and specifically the opening scene of the pilot episode. Not that it's a bad sequence by any means. In fact, I really love a lot of what the scene was doing. But a little bit of it was a lot of stuff that I felt was implied by last episode that I didn't really feel was super pertinent to see on the show. And the sequence they gave us was great, but I just felt it was a little bit unnecessary in the grand scheme of things. So if that's the biggest knock I can say, like a great sequence that was a tad bit unnecessary, I think we still have a very strong episode. So yeah, this is a great second episode. I really loved it, but to talk more about it, let's get into spoilers. So now that we're in spoilers, let's talk about the opening of the episode, because that's kind of what I was talking about a moment ago, where a sequence where I felt was a bit repetitious. The whole Indonesia sequence set in 2003, I get what it was doing. And I think it was very effective in it. It was showing us how, number one, this cordyceps fungus is a global event. It's not just contained to America. It was also sort of, I think, evoking a lot of like what we felt during the beginnings of, at least in America, of the pandemic with COVID-19, in that like we heard of this thing that was happening in China and a couple other places around the world, but it like wasn't something that we could get to America. And so we get to see like sort of the global, you know, infrastructure of it. And I really liked, by the way, was really worried when I saw the sequence going, and I'm like, oh, are they gonna say that it was like some sort of ineptitude on Indonesia's part, or like they created the fungus? Like, I was really worried that that's what they were going to do, because that could feel like it would lean into some really real world implications, considering how the U.S. government and Trump specifically used the things like the China virus to sort of instigate racism against China and Chinese people and Asian people generally here in the United States. So I was really glad that that wasn't the implication that they went for in the show. Like, I was glad that that sort of was like, I was really worried that that might be the implication, but no, it was just sort of showing the globalness of this, and the whole sequence was very full of dread, and it ended with this scientist lady being like, you just need to bomb everyone or else we're all going to die. And it just sort of like has that hopeless feeling that also sort of sets up where the world is by the time we get to 2003. It was interesting to watch to a degree. But I will also say that a lot of it felt a little bit unnecessary, because I feel like a lot of what was said here was implied by the opening sequence of the pilot episode, where we sort of got the implication of like, oh, the cordyceps evolved to live in humans and all of this stuff. And so, not that the sequence is bad by any means, and it did like sort of add those like ideas and themes to the show, but I feel like they're a little bit ancillary to what The Last of Us is, and feels a little bit more like probably Craig Mazin kind of wanting to take the ideas of The Last of Us and kind of give it a broader like global context and a like real world present day context, which isn't a bad thing necessarily. I don't hate that as a concept, but it did feel a little bit like, oh, we're going to sort of zoom out and tell you something a little bit like ancillary to the story that is being told here, to sort of give you the larger ramifications of it in terms of like how it reflects our real world today. So it wasn't bad, but I feel like it was showing stuff that was implied by the opening sequence, but made a little bit more textual. Showcase the hand of the author a little bit in terms of like what his intentions are for what the show is about directly. Not a bad sequence, but a little bit one where I'm like, oh, I can see the intentions here a little bit more than I feel like this story being told. Not bad, but I liked it. Oh, the other thing too with the opening that I want to mention is some people caught this in the pilot episode. I didn't, but people mentioned in the comments, which is why I'm catching it now, is if you noticed in the opening sequence, they said that the person was bit in Indonesia at a grain factory, which continues this implication that we saw in the pilot episode that the fungus spreads in grains and flour. There was like the fact that Joel and Sarah didn't eat pancakes and a couple other things that were in the pilot that just sort of like leads this theory that, oh, the fungus just spread through grains. So if any character eats bread in the next like few episodes, be wary of them, because that probably is a hint towards something that they're building on in the background. But speaking of that, let's actually get to the present day. I'll jump ahead a little bit because I'm talking about the fungus here. The biggest change that the present day sequence told us was that the fungus is not spread by spores as it was in the game, because if you watch the after scenes, like behind the show thing after the episode, they talk about like that is very video gamey. It was something that always like bothered me in video games. Like, how do you believe like one spore doesn't like get out and go down someone's throat like in the open air or something like that? I always found that a little bit unbelievable, but it works as a video game. But here they got rid of that, and it is just you get infected by bites and saliva and things like that. But also the fungus can sort of spread underground and creates this world wide web of like fungus underground going on, which I thought was just a very cool concept, and creates this like great tension of like, oh shit, we could accidentally alert people like miles away, the fungus, the infected miles away with this. I thought that's a good change from the game that like adds more tension to a visual, just a non-interactive medium that like it just adds to this universe versus the game. So thought that was a really unique and great change for this. But then this brings us to the story of the episode, which is, I think, a little bit just showing the odds between Tess and Joel in the face of Ellie being a possible cure. And this is something that was present in the games, too, where Tess is a character who we constantly see throughout this, like, wants to have hope, but doesn't really know how to like articulate it super well, but it's just sort of like, maybe this is something, and maybe we can actually make our like this not just about all the horrible things they did, but actually save this girl. And I like the small moments of arguments that came out in, like for example the bit where like they're arguing about Ellie and trying to figure out what to do with her, where Tess is like, well, we can take her, let's do this, and Joel's like, no, we need to go back, and she's like, no, we do this. And then like it escalates later when after they encounter the clickers, which we'll talk about, Tess Tess sort of says, like, why can't we just have a win for once? And sort of like showing like she does want to have hope, especially considering at that point she knows she's infected. So it's just like trying to find hope when Joel is a character who's just given up on any feeling of hope whatsoever. But I like that he gets kind of drawn into Ellie. They get little moments of Ellie humanizing herself to Joel, unintentionally, like Joel sort of playing around Ellie playing around in the hotel and Joel saying, like, you're a weird kid, and like, not like showing a ton of affection for her, but showing a vague interest in a way that a father would. And so I feel like that's like just showing drawing Joel out a little bit there, which I thought was really, really cool. And I think it culminates in a really wonderful sequence between Joel and Ellie where they're waiting for Tess. And I like this moment where Joel's like, don't ask questions of me. I'm not letting you in. I'm shoving you out. But then Ellie sort of draws out of him a different thing with still going at his humanity, where she asks, like, did you feel bad for killing any of the infected? And he reveals, like, yeah, sometimes. And so I like that moment because it sort of drew a moment of humanity out of Joel from Ellie that Joel didn't want to reveal, but he was honest with her about it because he knew that she would have to go through that at some point probably as well. So I like that Ellie, unintentionally, is like making Joel feel for her, even though Joel puts up these guards, and she is able to go about it around a way. And that sort of is reflected back because Ellie asks about the guard that Joel killed, and as we saw at the end of last episode, Ellie was kind of intrigued by the fact that Joel killed a man to protect her. Now, it was out of his trauma towards his own daughter, but I think Ellie was drawn to the fact that this man would commit such violence in order to protect her, which is someone that she's never had in her life. And so I like that she was sort of intrigued by that moment and asks him about it. And we don't get an answer there about Joel's feelings about it, but we get to see that. I think the more important thing was that Ellie was curious about it and is sort of drawn to Joel in that sense, as someone who can protect her and that will like be actively trying to defend her, even though Joel, I don't think, would have necessarily saw it that way. It was sort of his own trauma for his daughter that died 20 years ago, but might get sublimated onto Ellie. So just a great little, like, I love the writing of this show because those arcs are all there and very clear, but there's no moment where it just like really states it. You just sort of get it from what you know about the characters and the questions that they are asking and how they interact with each other. So very wonderful and nuanced and subtextual writing going on with all of these characters. Which then leads us to the two sequences, the big action sequences of the episode, which are the clicker sequence, where they go into the museum. Tense as all hell. Loved all of that. The clickers looked, like I said, looked gorgeous. The clicking noises were horrifying, exactly how I wanted them to sound. Like, as a fan of the game, they nailed it. The movements of the actors doing the clickers, like, just like flailing around as if they don't like even care about their bodies as they move, and just kind of pulled by thrust alone, I thought was just so good. And like the twitching that they do, like, it was so perfect. And the sequence that really got me was when Joel is like trying to quietly reload his gun and you just hear the clicking noise next to his head and he turns and it's like right there. Oh, that was so great, because that's something you don't really get in the game, of like how scary it must be to just reload quietly so they don't hear you. You just push a button in the game. So I thought that was just a great way to do that. And that whole sequence felt like very video gamey, like them hiding behind like shelves and things. Like, it felt straight out of the game, and like Joel liked having Ellie follow him, like really felt like it was right from that. So they adapted that so well, but managed to add a bunch of tense moments that wouldn't have been found in the video game, but managed to still bring that same tenseness even though you're not interacting with it. So I thought was a great sequence there. And then I like the end sequence too, where we do get to see that the cordyceps can like signal across miles because they just hit something, which pays that off here and might get paid off more down the line, and changes a little bit from the game, where in the game they were sort of confronted by the military, but here Tess stops these bunch of infected from going after them. So it's a little bit of a change there, but it adds this, like, again, horrifying beauty that I think like this show is doing really well. Like, the infected are disgusting, the world is destroyed, but in this decay there's beauty, and that's sort of like weirdly symbolized by the kiss that the infected gives to Tess as she blows them all up. It's disgusting and gross, and yet there's like a weird romanticism to it. And so just this idea of beautiful decay or beautiful like destruction or beautiful infection. Just an idea you don't see a lot in horror, like body horror and infection and decay is usually seen as gross and disgusting. So this idea of like beauty in there, and the show finding that visually is really strong and being very well evoked. So I was really I really liked that as a concept. It was like very repulsive, but also kind of intriguing, which I think is kind of a whole idea of the show too. The idea of these things that we find we should be repulsed by, we sometimes are drawn to, like violence, like Ellie being drawn to the violence that Joel does. Like, she should be repulsed by his violence, and yet she's drawn to it in the same way that we should be repulsed by the decay of these creatures, but are drawn into them. And so I really like those sort of echoing themes just in the visuals. I thought was really, really cool. So yeah, all that being said, I think another another really strong episode of The Last of Us. Like I said, a little bit not as good as the pilot, just on the back of I found the opening to be a little bit reiterative. But that's not to say it's bad, just a little bit reiterative. So if I had not seen the opening of episode 1, I would just say fantastic. So excellently strong episode, in my opinion. I'm loving the show so far. I think it's adapting this well. But what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But until next week, until the next episode, I wish you all a live long and prosper.